What's up, everybody? Welcome to Wise Guy Gazette. Today I'm doing a full review of the Phoibos Delphinus. If you're familiar with my comparisons, what I do is I break down the watch into a couple different categories and I assign a score on a scale of 1 to 10, and then at the end we'll total that up and get the percentage score for this watch. Starting off with the price, the Phoibos Delphinus retails at $450, and that's US dollars. I did get mine on sale a few months ago for $370 from Long Island Watch, so I would keep an eye out for sales because you might be able to pick this up for a little bit under the retail price. At $450, this is the most expensive watch in my collection. It's almost double some of the Chinese watches that I have from San Martin and other brands like that. So what I'm setting out to answer today is it worth $450? Is it worth it over Chinese brands like San Martin, Proxima, Seastern? And overall, how does this stack up against micro brands and other watches that are in this price point? Moving on to dimensions, this one is stated as 39 millimeters with a 46.5 lug to lug on the website, but I do like to get some real world measurements and just confirm that. We're looking at around 40 at the case and about 39 millimeters at the bezel. The lug to lug comes in at about 46.7 millimeters, and the overall thickness comes in at exactly 12 millimeters. It has a 7 millimeter crown, and the end links, I believe, are 20 millimeters. That's right, so we have 20 millimeter end links that taper down to, I believe, 16 millimeters. That's right, so we have a 20 to 16 bracelet taper, 7 millimeter crown, and the website specifications are pretty much correct. It's about a 39.5 or 39 by 46.5. So overall, this watch fits many different sizes of wrists. As you guys may know, I have a 6.25 inch wrist, so I do have small wrists. I was a little bit worried about the 46.5 lug to lug. I normally try to stick within 46 millimeters lug to lug to avoid overhang or the lugs kind of hanging off my wrist. But this case, because of how much the lugs turn down, does kind of wear a little bit smaller than that and hugs the wrist really well. So I would say this is a good mid-sized case. Pretty much will work for anyone. I would say that it wears on the smaller end of a 39. So if you do have large wrists, keep that in mind. It may be more suited for the mid-sized crowd or those who are looking for a smaller watch. Moving on to the crystal, what you're getting here is a double domed sapphire crystal. It has a very slight doming, just barely taller than a flat crystal. So the subtly domed crystal is actually really nice. It has good clarity. I believe they say it's 3 times coated on the underside with AR coating. So it does actually work quite well. You can see it's not very reflective, but if you do catch the wrong angle, you will get kind of the typical reflections that you see on any crystal. Overall, I'll give this crystal a 9 out of 10. Keep in mind, my rating system is in the context of budget watches. So I rate a lot of Chinese homage watches and other micro brands. So when I say 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10, I don't mean that, it's a perfect crystal. I just mean that in the context of the watches that I review, in this type of price point, I would give it a 9 out of 10. The Delphinus has a pretty pedestrian handset. They're just kind of pencil or stick hands, except for the second hand, which has a nice little red tip on it. But overall, they're finished pretty well. I would say that it's a pretty boring handset, but the important things like the length and the overall finishing are quite good. The minute hand and second hand both reach all the way out to the minute track, so the length is quite good. And like I said, the finishing is good, nothing outstanding. There's no beveled surfaces. It's pretty much just polished, but they do look good. So overall, like I said, I give the handset a 7 out of 10. Moving on to the dial. This is one of the more standout parts of this watch. You could say that this is a pretty boring or pedestrian watch. It's just a simple black diver, but the only thing that's really making it stand out is that it has this really nice sunburst. So if you've seen a Phoibos watch before, you'll know this sunburst. Instead of completely aligned straight sunburst streaks, what you get is more of a zigzag to each line. So it has a lot of character, and especially when it catches the light just right, it looks really, really good. And as someone who likes boring watches, just plain black dials, I also like that when you kind of hold this from afar, or if you're just wearing it, see it in the mirror, it does look like just a plain black dial as well. So it gives a little bit of visual interest when you're looking for it, but overall you get kind of a stealthy black dial experience. Within the dial segment, I also like to talk about the indices. What we have here is just simple applied indices, typical dive style with mostly circular indices and then the trapezoids and the triangle as well. You can see that the date cutout is actually a trapezoid, which matches the other indices on the dial. So I really like that detail as well. And the last thing I want to touch on in the dial segment is this watch does have a chapter ring, and it's kind of like a metallic brushed surface. Some people are a little bit skeptical of this look, but I think this works really well. If you catch it in the right light, this chapter ring actually just looks extremely good. It's not overly deep, it's pretty thin, but it just gives that little touch of something when you catch the right light that makes it look really good. So overall, with all those different elements considered, I'm giving the dial a 9 out of 10. It's one of my favorite dials on any of my watches. I like that it can be stealthy and look like a black dial, or when you really look at it, you get those details. And also, like I said, I really like the chapter ring, the indices look good. Overall, it's just a really nice dial. Next, let's talk about the case of this watch. I break down case into two segments, case finishing and case design. First, I'm going to start with case finishing. The finishing on this watch is extremely good. The brushing is extremely fine. The polishing seems very flat with no rippling. And overall, it's just an extremely well-finished watch. I would say it's above the standards of something like a San Martin, but not by a lot. San Martin does really good case finishing as well. But this one is just that tiny bit above those Chinese brands to where I can give this comfortably a 9 out of 10 for case finishing. In addition to being well finished, it actually has a very hard to execute and hard to finish design. If you look at some of the crown guard angles and the way this mid case is built up, this is kind of a hard to finish surface, so I'm very impressed with the level of brushing and polishing that we got on here. So, like I said, I will give this a 9 out of 10 for case finishing. As for case design, you're getting a pretty original design here. It could be inspired by some other watches, but overall I think it's pretty original and it looks extremely good. I would say that this is one of my favorite dive watch cases due to mostly the crown guards. They look good, especially from the side if you look at that profiling there. So the crown guards are extremely nicely sculpted and the way they fit into the mid case looks very good. You have a nice overall downturn to the lugs on both sides of the watch. It fits the wrist really well, and that overall 12mm thickness means it is just a thin watch overall. So as a complete package, I really like this case design, so much so that I'm willing to give this my first 10 out of 10. So this watch is housing a Miyota 9 series movement. So that's a high beat movement in terms of, relative to the Chinese watches I normally review. It's very thin, which allows this very thin case design. And it's also reliable, unlike some of the Chinese clone movements like the PT5000 and Seagull ST2130. So I think this is kind of the perfect compromise. When I'm buying in this price range, I think this would be my ideal movement because you get the reliability, it's easy to maintain, it's high beat relative to a Seiko NH35, for example, and it's reliable, like I said. So overall, really good movement choice. I'll give this a 9 out of 10. Okay, moving on to the bezel. This is another one I break up into multiple different categories. I have bezel action, bezel grip, and bezel insert. So starting with bezel action, the action on this one is what I would call very muted and dampened. The clicks are very quiet, but I would say it's pretty tactile. It's consistent. You don't have any hang-ups, and it overall feels good. You know when you're engaging each click, and it falls into place with not too much back play. But it's not the most clicky bezel. I think this partially comes with being a skin diver. I've reviewed a couple other thin watches with thin bezels, and they tend to have this softer clicking, unlike, a full-size dive watch with a very mechanical, loud click that you can audibly hear. So the bezel action is overall okay, depending on what you like. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. I prefer a little bit more tactile feeling, but I also like a quieter bezel so that you can operate it, in public, in a meeting without calling attention to the watch. So I do like that it's quiet, and overall I think a 7 out of 10 is fair. As for bezel grip, if you look at the sides, it's I don't know, I guess you could call this a Citizen ProMaster style, where it has coin edge indents, but they're spaced out by sections of smooth metal. So depending on where you grip, if you miss the knurling, you could have a little bit of slippage, but overall you will end up engaging with the grip. I think it's overall good for how thin the bezel is. I've had some thin bezels that are almost impossible to grip, so I'll give this an 8 out of 10. Decent, but not the grippiest that I've felt on a dive watch. Moving on to the last bezel category, the bezel insert. This is a fully loomed bezel. It's made of ceramic and it's relatively thin, which I like. It has good aesthetics. I like that it's not fully graded for the style of this watch. It looks a little bit dressier to just have the grading from up to the 15-minute. So I do like that aspect, and I love that it's fully loomed. And other than that, there's nothing much to write home about. It's just your typical ceramic bezel. It'll be pretty scratch resistant. It does not have engraved markers, or at least they are loom filled. So when you run your finger over the bezel, it will be completely smooth instead of having indents where the markings are. So overall, I give the bezel insert an 8 out of 10. Very standard dive watch insert, nothing special here, but still very good quality. Moving on to the end links. I'm very particular on end link fitment. I like to have a very good seamless integration with the case. So this is one of the categories that I deeply value. In this case, the execution is actually very good. The curve of the end links fits the lugs extremely well. If you look at the side profile, there's nothing sticking up or down from the lugs. So that's very good. However, you will see that there's a small gap on either end of the bracelet, the end link itself. So you can't actually wiggle it left and right on both sides of the bracelet. So I would have liked to see a little bit tighter machining there. I know that San Martin and other Chinese brands actually do a little bit better than Phoibos in this department. So I think that they could have improved that and made the overall finishing just a little bit tighter and maybe eliminate some wiggle in that end link. So I'll still give it an 8 out of 10. It could have been a 9 out of 10 if they just eliminated those gaps. Moving on to the bracelet design. What we have here is a beads of rice bracelet. You've probably seen this on other watches, but I do like this design a lot. I think it's kind of underrated. It looks really good in any lighting, but especially when it catches the light just right, it just looks so good. And also another benefit is beads of rice is fully articulating by nature. Some oyster links, the middle link and the sides will be kind of pinned together. So you don't get that full articulation, but on a beads of rice or a Jubilee or anything else that has fully articulating links, it will be a little bit more comfortable for most people. So overall, I'll give this a 9 out of 10 for the beautiful beads of rice bracelet. I really like this type of design, and I'd like to see it on more watches, although I think there has been a resurgence of, for example, San Martin using beads of rice in their designs. Next, on to the bracelet finishing. The finishing is pretty much like San Martin level, very high level brushing, extremely nice polishing on the beads themselves. You don't get much rattling, which is good, especially in watches that are fully articulating with smaller links. Basically, non-oyster bracelets tend to rattle a little bit more because you have more small pieces of metal. With the tolerances, they build up and stack, and you may have more movement overall. But this one's extremely tight, not too much flex, and not too much rattling. So overall, probably the best small link bracelet that I've felt. I would like to compare it to San Martin one day with the SN0116, but until then, I'll give this a 9 out of 10. Moving on to the clasp. This watch has a fully milled, on-the-fly adjustable clasp, and it's actually one of my favorites. I have a couple watches with on-the-fly adjustable clasps from San Martin, Seastern, and Erebus as well. And what I have noticed is they tend to be a little bit bulky. They tend to be long. They tend to be a little bit thick and sit off the wrist a little bit. And they also seem to be a little bit hard to operate depending on which brand you're using. They sometimes have tight springs or a tight mechanism, which makes it more difficult to use. This one actually avoids all of those shortcomings. It's actually a really nice size, not overly large. It's not overly thick or long. It's very nicely finished, just like you'd expect from, like I said, a typical San Martin or any other on-the-fly adjustable milled clasp. But instead of pushing a button to adjust, you actually go in here and just pull this lever down. And I find that a little bit easier to do than pushing in that tight button on the San Martin clasp. So overall, I think it's a little bit easier to operate. And more importantly, the size is a little bit more in check. I haven't measured them side by side, but just on the wrist, this clasp does feel a little bit more compact and fits on the wrist a little bit flatter. So I'll give the clasp a 9 out of 10. Very good clasp, works extremely well for the watch. It's signed, it looks good, it's finished well. What's not to like? Okay, moving on to the last category, which is fit. So as you can see, this watch fits pretty nicely on my 6¼ inch wrist. I think it would look even better maybe on a 7-inch or larger wrist, but it does accommodate smaller wrists well due to the shape of the case. If I do a quick wrist roll, you can see the clasp is sitting nicely on my wrist as well, and the bracelet conforms really nicely to the wrist. If I take a look from the side, you can see how closely this watch is hugging my wrist. It's really conforming and sits very flat, doesn't kind of stick high like some dive watches might. It's one of those watches that just fits the wrist like a glove. You don't have any clankiness, there's no sharp edges. And so overall, I'm going to give the fit a 10 out of 10. The only other watch that I've tested that competes with this is the Proxima PX 1697. That one's a little bit thinner and does have a really nice case profile. And I think they actually wear really similarly with their similar dimensions and just being skin diver type watches. So I feel comfortable giving this a 10 out of 10. Okay, so in conclusion, adding up all those different categories, this watch scored 121 points out of 140 possible, giving it an 86% score. That puts the Phoibos Delphinus as the official #1 watch in my entire collection in terms of raw score. And it's also the most expensive, so I believe that's fitting. And I think that the $450 that this retails for, I think it gets you a lot for your money when you compare to traditional brands like Seiko or Orient. You're getting a lot more watch for your money. You're getting better specifications. You're still getting an original design too, so it's not like an homage watch where the specs are better, but you have to deal with wearing some sort of copy of a big brand watch. This one is its own design, and it has those high-level specs for a pretty good price. So in my opinion, the $450 is a fair retail price for this watch. However, I would try to look out for sales, try to get this under $400 if you can, or even buy one on the used market. I think these would hold up pretty well. As you saw in the review, mine's pretty beat up. Mine gets used pretty heavily. I don't baby this thing. It's my daily. It has been since Christmas. So it's getting those scratches and different things, but it still looks great. So if you want to pick one up for a little bit less, I would recommend that you look at the used route. And if you can't swing something like $450 for these entry-level micro brands, I don't think that there's that much in it between these and the Chinese brands to make it something where you have to spend the $450. I think you can still get a really close quality watch from San Martin or Seastern or Proxima for more like $250. So at that price range, if you're not valuing the original design and the customer service that you get with this watch, you could be better suited going for something cheaper from a Chinese brand like that. All right, everybody, thank you so much for watching another review. Keep your eyes peeled. I think I'm going to be having an Erebus Origin 38 review in this exact same format. So if you haven't, please subscribe and drop a like on this video, and I'll keep content like this coming. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.